The funny thing about working at Weekend Update is that you can spend an entire week reading headlines about wars, elections, economic anxiety, and whatever strange thing happened on the internet that morning, in seconds, you find yourself standing across from a man whose entire mission in life is to yell, "On blast!" while cake somehow appears from nowhere. That's television. 1 minute, Michael Che and I are delivering jokes about serious issues, trying to balance news with comedy, and the next minute I'm looking across the desk wondering whether the laws of physics have quietly resigned from the building. The night started like a fairly normal edition of Weekend Update. The audience was loud before we even walked on stage. You could feel the excitement bouncing around Studio 8H. There's something contagious about a crowd that's ready to laugh before you've even opened your mouth. It makes everything feel a little easier, even if you're secretly wondering whether a joke you wrote at 2 in the morning is about to die a slow, painful death. Che and I settled into our usual rhythm. The headlines came first: politics, current events. The kind of stories that make you wonder if the world has completely lost interest in behaving normally. Then we arrived at a statistic that honestly caught people's attention. A recent poll had found that 3 out of every 4 Americans believed the right to free speech was heading in the wrong direction. That's one of those stories that's serious enough to make people pause, but broad enough that, comedy is about to sneak through the side door. So I introduced our guest. I said something along the lines of, "Here to cut through the noise and speak his mind is Mr. On Blast." The audience erupted, not because they knew exactly what was coming, mostly because they sensed chaos. And chaos is usually a safe investment on live television. Out walked Mr. On Blast. The confidence arrived before he did. He looked like someone who had spent years preparing speeches that nobody had asked him to give. He didn't ease into the interview, he exploded into it. The very first thing out of his mouth wasn't a greeting, it wasn't a thank you. Instead, he looked directly at me and cheerfully announced, "Hello, Colleen." Now, I've been called plenty of things in my career, some flattering, some less flattering, but Colleen was definitely a new one. The audience laughed immediately. I hadn't even had time to process whether correcting him was worth the effort. Before I could react, he proudly introduced himself. "That's right, I'm Mr. On Blast." He spoke with the absolute certainty of someone convinced that history would someday dedicate an entire chapter to him. Then he explained his mission. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't holding back. He wasn't worried about offending anybody. He wanted everyone to prepare themselves because nobody was safe. Everyone, according to him, was about to be on blast. Right on cue, dramatic music blasted through the studio. The audience cheered. It sounded less like an interview and more like the entrance of a professional wrestler whose finishing move was public criticism. I figured we'd let him get rolling. Sometimes the best strategy during Weekend Update is simply to let a character reveal themselves, so I encouraged him. "Go ahead," I said. "Lay it on us." He wasted absolutely no time. His first target? Artificial intelligence. He stared ahead dramatically. "Aye," he declared, "what are we doing?" He sounded genuinely disappointed in humanity. Prompts this, prompts that. Then he reached his conclusion. "I? More like PU." He paused just long enough to enjoy his own setup, then shouted, "On blast!" The music hit again. The audience applauded enthusiastically. I tried to maintain the kind of neutral expression that says, "I'm listening respectfully." Internally wondering whether this was going to be 90 seconds or 9 hours, I finally responded. Okay, I gave him what was probably the most honest academic evaluation possible, kind of starting at a C-. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't exactly brilliant either. He ignored my assessment completely. Momentum was clearly more important than grades. Without missing a beat, he shifted subjects. "You all want to talk about the metaverse?" He practically scoffed at the very idea. Psh! Then he delivered his alternative. "Why don't you go read a Bible verse?" Now, I had questions because that wasn't exactly the direction I expected the conversation to go. I looked at him.
"So you're Christian?"
He answered instantly. "Devout. No hesitation, no explanation, just complete confidence. The word landed like it settled every possible question, except it really didn't. Because seconds later, he pivoted back toward technology. Apparently, he wasn't finished criticizing artificial intelligence. He started listing companies. Silly Cant Valley.
That alone got another laugh. Then he rattled off names.
Gemini clawed toward another punchline.
ChatGPT?
He shook his head dramatically, more like ChatG. He leaned into the microphone. PU. Then came the inevitable payoff. On blast, music, cheers, applause. The formula was becoming familiar. Tear it, pun, explosion, repeat. But then something happened that completely derailed my train of thought. Cake, actual cake, out of nowhere, not metaphorical cake. Not a joke about cake, a real cake appeared. I stared at it, then at him, then back at the cake. My brain was desperately trying to locate the missing steps between ChatGPT and baked goods. There weren't any. So I asked the only reasonable question: where did the cake come from? He looked at me with complete confidence. Oh, you're not ready for that conversation, sweet cheeks? Sweet cheeks. Nobody preparing for a serious interview expects to hear those words, Then he reached over and touched my hands that crossed several invisible workplace boundaries all at once. I immediately pulled back. Don't touch my... I tried to stay polite. Don't call me sweet cheeks. And don't touch my hands. It felt like a perfectly reasonable request. He accepted my complaint with almost no visible concern. Instead, he simply moved on to his next victim. The stock market, if there was one thing I'd learned in the first few minutes, it was that absolutely nothing was safe. Technology had already been blasted. The metaverse had been blasted. Artificial intelligence had definitely been blasted. Now, Wall Street was apparently next. He looked almost disappointed in the financial system. The stock market. He shrugged. Always going up, always going down. He paused dramatically before delivering what he clearly believed was the perfect solution. Here's an idea. Stay still. Then he shouted it again. On blast! The audience burst into laughter. I couldn't help interrupting this time. Okay, no, stop it. I laughed despite myself. You want the stock market to stay still? It was such an absurd solution that I honestly wanted to hear the explanation. I didn't really have one. Instead, he smiled proudly. Yeah, I'm ruthless. That confidence somehow made the joke even funnier. There wasn't a trace of doubt in his voice. He genuinely sounded like he'd solved economics forever. And standing there beside him, I realized this interview had officially abandoned logic several minutes ago. Oddly enough, it was only getting started. By that point, I'd completely given up trying to predict where the conversation was headed. Normally, even the wildest Weekend Update interviews have some kind of pattern. You can usually spot the rhythm after a minute or two. The character has a point of view, a recurring joke, and maybe one big surprise waiting around the corner. where On Blast was operating under an entirely different system. His pattern was that there wasn't one. Every time I thought I understood him, he'd veer off in another direction with complete confidence, leaving me to wonder whether I was interviewing a political commentator, a motivational speaker, or someone who had wandered into Studio 8H after taking 3 wrong turns. Still, the audience was loving every second of it. Every pause felt dangerous. Every sentence felt like it might end with another explosion of theme music. Every time I started to think, surely he can't top that, he somehow managed to find another target. He leaned back with a satisfied grin, almost like he was checking names off an invisible list. Then he proudly announced, because blasting is my mitzvah. There was a tiny beat of silence. Then he followed it with an enthusiastic Lakeem. The audience erupted again. I blinked. I'd only recently learned that according to him, he was a devout Christian. Now he was casually dropping Jewish expressions with complete authority. I couldn't let that slide. I looked over at him.
Wait, so you're Jewish too?
Without the slightest hesitation, he answered exactly the same way he'd answered before. Devout. That was it. No clarification, no explanation, just devout. The audience laughed even harder because somehow that one word had become his answer to absolutely everything. At that point, I realized asking follow-up questions wasn't helping. If anything, they were just giving him more opportunities to answer in ways that made even less sense. Still, curiosity is a dangerous thing. Once you start asking questions, it's hard to stop. Unfortunately for me, Mr. On Blast had already moved on. He wasn't interested in discussing religion anymore. He had another group in his sights, corporate America. He leaned toward the camera with the confidence of someone preparing to expose a massive conspiracy. Now, he paused dramatically, blasting on toward CEOs. He looked proud of the transition before immediately interrupting himself, or should I say, he smiled. Snooze? I couldn't help laughing. It wasn't even that clever. It was the complete commitment that sold it. Delivered every pun like he just discovered the greatest joke in comedy history. I shook my head. No, that was all I could manage. Just no. He ignored my reaction entirely. Apparently, approval wasn't part of his process. He continued speaking directly to executives everywhere. Hey, CEOs, I hear you make a lot of money. He let the audience settle for a moment. Too bad you can't buy yourself a moral compass. There it was, the criticism, and just when everyone expected it, on blast, the music hit again. At this point, the sound cue had become less of a surprise and more of a reflex. The audience almost seemed trained to clap the instant they heard it. I started wondering whether the band had their fingers hovering over the button all night, just waiting for him to say the magic words. Before I could make another comment, something happened that genuinely caught me off guard. The camera feed changed 1 second. He was standing beside the Weekend Update desk. The next second, he wasn't. Instead, he suddenly appeared somewhere else entirely on one of the monitors, standing in what looked like one of those backstage areas where production keeps photographs and graphics. He looked around proudly. Hi, I'm Mr. On Blast, and I'm in the place where they put the pictures. The audience exploded. I stared at the monitor, then at the empty spot where he'd been standing, then back to the monitor. Even after years of live television, moments like that still make you pause. You know, there's a technical explanation. You know, somebody backstage has spent hours rehearsing the timing, but in the moment, your brain refuses to cooperate. All it can think is, wait! I laughed. What the hell? Then I asked the question everyone in the room was probably thinking. How did you do that? He didn't even pretend it was complicated. My grandson works on the show. He said it like that answered everything. The audience loved it. Of course they did. It was somehow both completely ridiculous and strangely believable. I frowned. You have a grandson? It didn't seem to fit anything I'd learned about him so far. He smiled warmly. Devout. There it was again, the universal answer. Apparently, devout could now explain family relationships too. I couldn't help laughing. Every normal conversation rule had officially collapsed. He returned to center stage looking completely satisfied with himself. Then, for the first time all night, he sounded almost sincere. Now, he sighed dramatically. Give me and my family a break, Colleen. Again, Colleen. I had accepted by then that correcting him wasn't going to accomplish anything. He continued. It's hard up here. There was something unexpectedly sympathetic about the line. For a split second, it almost felt like he was dropping the character and asking for a little understanding. I nodded. You know what? I bet it is hard. I meant it. Performing in front of a live audience isn't easy. Whether you're playing yourself or a character, you're taking a risk every time you open your mouth. So for one brief moment, it felt like we had found common ground. The interview had finally settled into something resembling a genuine conversation. That feeling lasted approximately 1 second because I looked over at him, really looked at him. And before I could stop myself, I delivered the observation that apparently been waiting in the back of my mind all interview, especially when you're out here looking like a lesbian Bruno Mars. The audience completely lost it. I almost started laughing before I'd even finished the sentence. Sometimes a joke lands because it's clever. Sometimes it lands because everyone in the room immediately pictures exactly what you're talking about. This was definitely the second category. He froze for just a beat, long enough for me to think I'd finally gotten the upper hand. I even allowed myself a tiny smile. Maybe, just maybe, I'd managed to put Mr. On Blast on the defensive. I should have known better. The instant my sentence ended, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even react with fake outrage. Instead, he calmly pointed right back at me. On blast, the music crashed in again, only this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual triumphant sound effect accompanying my victory or defeat, a loud fart noise echoed through the studio. The audience burst into uncontrollable laughter. I immediately looked around in disbelief. "No!" I shouted. I couldn't believe it. Every previous On Blast had been followed by dramatic music. Mine, the one directed at me, got a fart. I looked genuinely offended. Why did mine sound like that? The timing couldn't have been worse or better, depending on whose side you were on. Mr. On Blast smiled with absolute satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who had patiently waited all night for exactly this moment. He delivered the line he'd been building toward from the very beginning. "Looks like you just got put." He paused dramatically. On blast. The audience roared, even I couldn't help laughing. It was impossible not to. The entire interview had been leading toward me becoming the target. I should have seen it coming. Instead, I'd walked straight into it. Just when I thought the sketch had reached its natural ending, it wasn't finished. He suddenly looked toward the wings of the studio. His voice got louder. "Blast, boys! Get out here!" Almost immediately, music filled the room again. The energy shifted from interview to full celebration. The group rushed onto the stage as the audience cheered and clapped along. The entire set suddenly felt less like Weekend Update and more like the closing moments of a bizarre late-night variety show where normal rules no longer applied. I watched everything unfold with the expression of someone who had completely surrendered. There wasn't any point trying to restore order. Order had left the building a long time ago. All I could really do was laugh. And honestly, so was everyone else. As the music kept playing, I sat there behind the Weekend Update desk with the kind of smile that only comes from accepting complete defeat. There are moments on live televisions when you know you're still technically hosting the segment, but everyone else in the room has decided that the show belongs to somebody else now. This was one of those moments. The audience was clapping in rhythm. The studio lights reflected off every corner of the set. The energy in the room had completely transformed from a simple interview into something that felt like a celebration of organized nonsense. And standing right in the middle of it all was Mr. On Blast. He looked happier than ever, not because he'd solved any national problems, not because he'd won an argument, but because he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. He'd put absolutely everyone. Looking back on it, that's probably what made the entire interview work. He never tried to convince anyone he was right. He never attempted to build a logical case. He simply moved from one target to the next with complete confidence, acting as though every observation deserved its own dramatic announcement. Artificial intelligence, on blast the metaverse, on blast the stock market, definitely on blast corporate executives, on blast eventually me, very much on blast. The audience loved the rhythm because they quickly learned the rules, or at least they thought they had. Every setup promised another over-the-top criticism. Every punchline ended exactly the same way. Then the music exploded. It became a game. The crowd started anticipating it. You could almost hear people silently counting the seconds until the next On Blast. What's funny is that the catchphrase wasn't really the joke by itself. It was the commitment. Mr. On Blast delivered every opinion with the confidence of someone announcing a major historical discovery, whether he was talking about artificial intelligence or the stock market. His certainty never changed. He genuinely believed everything deserved to be publicly blasted, even if the criticism itself made absolutely no sense. Take the stock market, for example. His solution to all its ups and downs was simply stay still. That was it. No complicated economic theory, no charts, no financial analysis, just stay still. As ridiculous as it sounded, it was exactly the kind of absurd simplicity that makes live audiences laugh. Sometimes comedy isn't about solving a problem. Sometimes it's about pretending the world's biggest problems have the easiest possible answers. Of course, he didn't stop there. One of my favorite moments to think back on is still the conversation about religion. I'd asked what seemed like a perfectly reasonable question. When he brought up reading a Bible verse, he naturally assumed he was telling us he was Christian. So you're Christian? Devout. Simple enough. Then a few moments later, after proudly declaring that blasting was his mitzvah and celebrating with a cheerful l'chaim.
Another perfectly reasonable question. So you're Jewish too?
Again, devout. Exactly the same answer, no explanation, no hesitation, just complete confidence. By then, the audience knew what was coming, and somehow that made it even funnier. Every repetition landed harder because everyone recognized the pattern. Comedy often works that way. The audience becomes part of the rhythm. They're laughing not only at the joke, but also at the anticipation of it. And then there was the cake. To this day, if someone asks me what the most confusing object in that interview was, I won't hesitate. The cake wins. Now, question, one moment we were talking about ChatGPT, the next moment there was cake, real cake, sitting there as though baked goods naturally appear whenever someone criticizes technology. I remember staring at it, honestly trying to understand whether I'd somehow missed a line. Maybe there had been a reference. Maybe I'd looked down at my notes for half a second. No, there was no explanation. When I asked where it had come from, I didn't receive an answer. Instead, I got called sweet cheeks. Not exactly the clarification I'd hoped for. And just to make sure the moment stayed as uncomfortable as possible, he reached over and touched my hands. I immediately objected. Don't call me sweet cheeks. Don't touch my hands. It felt like the most normal sentence spoken during the entire interview. Everything else had drifted so far into absurdity that asking someone to respect basic personal space suddenly sounded like the voice of reason. Of course, he barely acknowledged it before moving on to another target. That was his style. Nothing slowed him down. Not questions, not logic, not common sense. Every conversation was simply another stepping stone toward the next blast. Then there was the disappearing act. I've worked around television production long enough to appreciate the amount of planning that goes into even a tiny visual gag. Timing has to be perfect. Cameras have to be in exactly the right places. Everyone backstage has to hit their cues at precisely the right moment. So when Mr. On Blast suddenly appeared somewhere else in the building, introducing himself as being in the place where they put the pictures, it caught me completely off guard. My reaction wasn't acting. I genuinely laughed. Then came one of the simplest explanations imaginable. My grandson works on the show. That line still makes me smile. It takes something technically impressive and explains it with the most casually ridiculous answer possible. Naturally, I had another question.
You have a grandson?
And naturally, devout. At that point, it stopped trying to decode the meaning. Maybe devout meant yes. Maybe it meant no. Maybe it meant he simply enjoyed watching me ask questions that would never receive sensible answers. Whatever the case, the audience was completely with him. Then came the one moment where I thought just for a second that I had regained control. He asked for a break. He said it was hard up there. And honestly, I believed him. Standing in front of a live audience isn't easy. Comedy asks performers to take chances over and over again. Sometimes the audience roars. Sometimes they stare. You never really know until the words leave your mouth. Easter. So when he said it was hard, I offered him a little sympathy. I really did. I even admitted that I could imagine how difficult it must be. But then I looked at him, really looked at him. The comparison simply escaped before I could stop it, looking like a lesbian Bruno Mars. It was one of those jokes that arrives fully formed. You don't negotiate with it. You either say it or you don't. I said it. The audience exploded. For one glorious second, I thought I'd finally landed the knockout punch. Instead, I walked directly into the trap. He calmly pointed at me. On blast! Then came the sound effect, not triumphant music. Dramatic fanfare, a fart, a loud, unmistakable fart. The audience laughed even harder than before. My immediate reaction was genuine confusion. Why did mine sound like that? It felt deeply unfair. Everyone else had received dramatic musical accompaniment. I got bathroom humor. Apparently, that was my reward. His response couldn't have been more satisfying. Looks like you just got put on blast. Perfect timing, perfect confidence, perfect ending. Or so I thought, because he still had one final surprise. Blast Boys, get out here! Suddenly, the stage filled with even more energy. Music echoed through the studio. People poured onto the set. The audience rose to another level of excitement. At that point, there wasn't much left for me to do except enjoy the ride. Sometimes that's the best part of live comedy. You stop trying to steer. You simply let the moment happen. Eventually, the music began to wind down. The applause kept rolling through Studio 8H. I knew exactly what had to come next. The show still had to move forward. No matter how chaotic the previous few minutes had been, somebody eventually has to wrap everything up. So I smiled toward the audience, still laughing, still trying to recover from the fart sound effect.
I said what every host says when a wonderfully ridiculous guest has completely taken over the desk.
Okay, Mr. On Blast, everyone! The audience responded with one final burst of cheers and applause. It felt like the perfect ending, except he wasn't quite finished. As he walked away, he turned back one last time. Dev out. Another step. Dev out. Then again. On blast. Another beat. Dev out. The audience laughed all over again. Even his exit had become part of the joke. He couldn't leave without one more reminder of exactly who he was. And that's something I've come to appreciate about sketches like this. They're built around commitment, not complicated plots, not elaborate storytelling, just one character who believes in his own ridiculous worldview with absolute certainty. Mr. On Blast never questioned himself, not once. He believed every criticism deserved a dramatic declaration. He believed every conversation needed another target. He believed Dev Out could answer almost any question. And somehow, because he committed so completely, the audience happily followed him through every absurd twist. That's the magic of live sketch comedy. It asks everyone in the room to accept impossible things for a few minutes. Cake appears without explanation. People teleport to mysterious rooms where pictures are kept. Grandsons apparently solve production mysteries. The stock market should simply stop moving. Religious identities overlap without explanation. A host can accidentally end up with a fart sound effect while everyone else gets heroic music. None of it makes logical sense. All of it makes comedic sense. When the sketch ended and the applause finally settled, I found myself smiling at how quickly the whole thing had unfolded. It had started with a poll about free speech, a perfectly ordinary news item, the kind of story that usually leads to thoughtful discussion or political debate. Instead, it introduced a man who decided the best use of free speech was loudly putting the entire world on blast. Maybe that's the real joke. In a world where everyone seems eager to share opinions, Mr. On Blast simply skipped straight to the conclusion. No long speeches, no careful arguments, just one target after another, a dramatic catchphrase and complete confidence. As I watched him disappear backstage, still muttering Dev Out under his breath, I couldn't help laughing. Only on Weekend Update could a conversation about free speech somehow include artificial intelligence, the metaverse, Bible verses, ChatGPT, CEOs, cake, disappearing acts, grandchildren, Bruno Mars, a fart sound effect, and a parade of Blast Boys, and somehow still feel like it all belonged together. That's live television. You prepare as much as you can. You rehearse. You write. You hope. And then someone walks out, calls you Colleen, puts the entire world on blast, somehow manages to put you on blast, and leaves to thunderous applause. Honestly, that's a pretty good night at Weekend Update.